They didn't know she was the black CEO. Minutes later, half the dealership was fired. A brochure hit the floor like a small, careless rock. It skidded across the tile and stopped at the footsteps of a woman who had walked in with nothing but a folded coat and a patient expression. The receptionist behind the desk, Tessa Ward, made a face as if the brochure's landing were a personal insult. Two sales agents nearby exchanged a lean, familiar grin. Someone lifted a phone. "You can't be in here," Tessa said, the words flat and sharp, as if she were reading a rule from an invisible handbook. She tossed another brochure, not toward a hand, but at the woman's feet. "This showroom is for serious buyers." The woman didn't snap back. She didn't plead. She brushed the brochure aside with an almost apologetic motion, as if apologizing for taking up space. The laughter in the corner was low and private, meant for colleagues, not for customers. One agent smirked and mouthed to another, "Film it." Across the room, an intern named Jordan stood with his clipboard, notebook closed, eyes on the scene. He stayed quiet. He watched the woman's shoulders not rise, not fall, only steady. A customer who had been seated by the coffee bar looked away, cheeks going empty with embarrassment. Everyone in the room felt the temperature of the interaction dip. It was humiliating and precise, the kind of small cruelty that lives in quick gestures and practiced indifference. Tension folded the space. Some expected an eruption, a shouted comeback, a dragged-out dispute. Mark Dennison, a senior agent known for enforcing the showroom's unwritten rules, reached for his radio. "Security," he said into it, calm as if calling a lodging. The woman waited. Her hands were still. She leaned forward and set a single item on the counter, a corporate memo, crisply printed, no flourish, no raised voice. Faces leaned in like people toward a glass in which they were about to see themselves. "If this is gripping, watch until the end to see what happened next." The memo bore her name, Dr. Camille Royce. Beneath it, in embossed letters that glinted under the fluorescent lights, was the company seal. Without theatrics, she placed her executive ID on top, a metal badge that read, CEO. The badge caught the overhead light and threw it back in a clean, small arc. For a brief heartbeat, nothing happened. Then color drained from faces. Jaws slackened. Tessa's hand, which had been poised for another toss, froze halfway. The agent stopped smiling. The phone lowered, the camera now a different thing, a witness, not a weapon. Camille spoke, voice even, steady. She said she had come because reports had arrived, customers treated poorly, staff making jokes, a pattern of exclusion and mockery. "I'm here to see it for myself," she said. No accusation, no spectacle. Just a fact placed on the counter like the badge. Someone from corporate compliance was already on an open line. The showroom's manager, called from the back, appeared with his coat still half-fastened. He stood small by the desk, apologetic before knowing what to apologize for. Camille kept her hands visible on the memo, the gesture contained but authoritative. Her composure did not flush into triumph. It simply halted the room's performance. They moved quickly, but by the book. Compliance requested the lobby footage, pulled the sales floor cameras, and opened the internal chat logs. A tablet was passed around the counter. Thumbnails of short videos showed the same posture of mockery repeated across weeks. A Slack channel scrolled up on the screen, messages that treated customers like props. Screenshots circulated as jokes, a tone that normalized looking down instead of serving. One clip showed Tessa leaning over a counter, speaking to someone who had walked in alone, head bowed, hands folded, as if she were instructing them in how to appear less like a customer. Another clip showed Mark snapping a photo of a visitor and sending it with a laughing emoji. The words in the messages were clinical enough to be damning. Offhand comments framed as humor, suggestions about who was serious and who wasn't, and a repeated dismissiveness toward certain visitors. Camille watched these things with a restraint that felt like a quiet rebuke. She did not raise her voice. She did not gloat. She did not demand theater. She let the evidence speak, moving pictures and written traces of a decision made, again and again, by the same people. "You made a decision," she said finally, Not to the woman at the counter, but to the room. A pattern. HR stepped in, composed and practical. They called the names of those directly involved. The action was precise. Access revoked, badges deactivated, security to escort. Tessa, Mark, and 3 senior agents were asked to gather their belongings. The manager who had apologized stayed, shaking softly as his team was led toward the exit. Jordan was not called. Jordan remained where he had stood, posture correct, eyes steady. The firings were not a public spectacle. There was no triumphant drum roll. Badges were turned in. Handshakes were absent. A handful of employees walked out past the customers they had derided. Those customers tipped their heads in a complicated mix of relief and sorrow. Some had eyes wet with tears, not for revenge, but for dignity returned in a small, late way. Camille addressed the showroom then, her voice low but carrying. She acknowledged the customers who had been disrespected. She said simple things, that respect is non-negotiable, that leadership is responsible for enforcing that respect, that words and jokes have weight. She named the problem plainly, racial profiling and mockery, without sermonizing, and outlined the immediate steps corporate would take: retraining, a review of customer-facing policies, public apologies where appropriate, and new oversight. She did not promise the world. She promised action. She singled out Jordan. He had moved a chair for an elderly customer earlier, had acknowledged someone who had been ignored at the counter, had closed his notebook when the exchange started, and kept his focus on service. Camille called him forward, unclipped a small pin from her lapel, and gave him a new title. A promotion, modest but meaningful, and the responsibility to be part of a committee rebuilding the showroom's culture. The remaining staff looked at one another, then at the doorway through which their colleagues had left. The room felt hollowed in some places, relieved in others. Reporters on the sidewalk had already started to film the comings and goings. A single short clip of the badge placed on the counter spread first through a local feed, then broader. By the time Camille walked out, a crowd of cameras and phones waited. She stepped into the sunlight without rushing. Outside, she spoke to a small cluster of reporters, not to boast, but to state a principle. "This isn't about making an example," she said. "It's about making our standards clear." Then, quieter, more precise, "That real power doesn't shout." The viral video did exactly what those cameras often do. It carried a moment beyond the showroom, into timelines and group chats, into offices where leaders watched and took notes. People debated the ethics of undercover visits. Some praised the decisiveness. Others warned that one action won't undo deeper habits. Camille's reply to both was to keep the work public and ongoing. Evidence-based reviews, transparent reporting, and accountability measures that could be examined, not merely announced. Inside the dealership, customers who had been sidelined earlier came forward to say thank you. Some left with brochures now offered politely. The coffee machine hummed. The floor felt different, quieter in a way that promised attention rather than indifference. Camille didn't linger for applause. She listened, allowed a few questions, then walked back to her car. She carried no satisfaction in spectacle, only the weight of responsibility. Half the dealership had been dismissed that afternoon, an extreme step, taken because a pattern had been documented, and because leadership chose not to look away. What rippled after was less certain than the clip that made the rounds. Policies changed. Retraining began. Conversations took place in break rooms that might have been avoided before. None of that declared a cure for the deeper problems that allow small humiliations to take root. But in that lobby, on a weekday, dignity was restored to the person who had been dismissed as a non-customer, and a young intern was given a chance to shape what came next. When cameras tried to frame a heroic moment, Camille refused the story. She reiterated that power, when exercised well, is quiet and accountable. "We adjust when necessary," she said, "and we learn." The dealership would not be fixed by a single day. Yet for the customers who watched their mockers leave, for Jordan who now had a role to reshape culture, and for the staff who remained and would have to choose differently, the consequences were immediate. The image of a brochure flung like a disposable thing remained, but it no longer landed on the floor and stayed there. It had been picked up, examined, and put back into a place where it could no longer be used as a weapon. If this story made you think about leadership and accountability, subscribe for more real workplace stories and lessons that matter.